Okay, we are recording. Welcome everyone to our talk with Dr. Maria Armoudian today. Nice to see some people here. Just a couple of housekeeping tips before we do anything else. This is set up as a meeting, not a webinar, because webinars are extremely expensive. So I only have the meeting account. If you'd like to contribute to our efforts to get a webinar account or to Democrats Abroad's get out the vote efforts, you can do that at democratsabroad.org/donate. And I will put the link to that in the chat. Also, excuse me. We ask that you keep yourselves muted and use the chat for any questions. I will be monitoring the chat for questions. I'm also monitoring it to make sure everyone stays polite and respectful. And so please do. If there's time, we will unmute everyone to ask questions directly toward the end. If you're an American abroad and would like to become involved in Democrats Abroad, you can use that link without the /donate to join. If you'd like to, I mentioned contributing. And if you like what you hear from Dr. Armoudian and you want to learn more, I will drop a link to where you can purchase her book, her latest book, directly from the publisher in the chat. I'd like to start out with, first, excuse me, I forgot to introduce myself and Jennifer Frost, who is an absolutely wonderful leader and presenter and just everything. She's awesome. I'm Christine Valverde. I'm chairperson of Democrats Abroad New Zealand. And you can, if you're interested in that, you can always reach me at my laptop is doing something odd. You can always reach me at my email address, which I'm putting in the chat. And Jennifer Frost is very heavily involved in Democrats Abroad New Zealand. She has more titles than we have time to even use in her introduction. And I'm sure that a lot of you actually know Jennifer and already have contact information for her. Let me just drop that link in the chat. First, I want to ask the first question before handing it over to Jennifer and to Dr. Armoudian. Dr. Armoudian, what prompted you to write this latest book? I'm really curious about that.
That's a great question. Sorry for all the lawn mowing going on. If you can hear it, the microphone, but it's that season. Look, can I first just say thank you, Christine Valverde and Jennifer Frost, for putting this together at Democrats Abroad. I'm so grateful that you are here. It's so nice to have a community here in New Zealand when we're all kind of far from home. And I also just want to say happy birthday, Joe Biden, because it is his birthday and I am very glad that he was born. And so I'm celebrating good things, including Joe Biden's birth and all the great things that he has managed to do despite all of these obstacles. This book it's my third book, and that's meaningful because this project really probably started when I was politically active in the United States. I have been involved in several different NGOs, environmental NGOs, Americans for Democratic Action, and several others, including Pacifica Radio, KPFK. And I sat on these boards, and I had been a journalist, but then I went to work for the California legislature with the grand idea that I could, make a difference, and with some big legislative ideas, especially the big ones I wanted to do were around corporate reform, because I thought corporations were kind of at the heart of everything, whether they were human rights, environmental sustainability, labor rights, community issues, that so much of the US and abroad was affected by these big corporate activities. And so I went to work for the legislature, and then I ended up also a commissioner in the city of Los Angeles, working on a lot of these issues in so many ways. And what I found was that it was extraordinarily hard to make a difference. And big legislation, especially something like corporate reform, would get killed in the first committee. And it was getting killed by, big lobby groups like the Chamber of Commerce, and it was getting killed by big groups like the Bankers Association, for kind of profit motive reasons. And so I thought, you know what, I am really struggling to make a difference. I want to go back and study why it's so hard. And what are I want to look at it as a systems thing, as a study. So I went back to do my PhD. And the first area that I started to look at was media and how media affected politics. And there were several different layers of this. And the first layer was that there was extremist media that was turning friend against friend, family member against family member. And I saw it within my own family. I saw it with my dad, for example, for a long time. He had started listening to the extreme right-wing radio like Rush Limbaugh, and he couldn't even talk to him anymore. That changed, by the way. He did come to his senses. But I was watching that, and I was studying media in really extreme situations like Rwanda and the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, and then in other places where you had really pretty stable democracies that had completely fallen apart, like Chile. And I saw the common thread in all of those, which were particular kinds of media messages, and they were the same kinds that were being used by the extreme right wing and being broadcast all over the United States. And that was obviously pre-internet. So I wrote the book Kill the Messenger back then. That was 10 years ago, almost 11 now. And I wrote it sort of as, look at what could happen to the United States. And of course, it is sort of happening. But then as I kept going and studying the systems, and the problem seemed so intense and becoming more and more difficult to solve, I learned about the Burmese situation in the 90s, which many of you may be familiar with. Now it's called Myanmar, of course, but there was a pipeline being built in Burma, and there were these two big oil companies, Total of France and Unocal of California, and they were involved in this partnership with the Burmese regime to extract oil and build a pipeline. And this was one of many of these kind of marriages between multinational corporations and authoritarian regimes, in which people who live there, often indigenous people who'd been living on their indigenous lands for centuries, were having their lives upended, were ending up, in situations where they were either massacred or tortured or some horrific, heinous situation. And it looked like, because of the way the international system had been set up, that there was nothing that any of us could do about it. This was in an authoritarian government. We've got these ideas that are like sovereignty and that are like sovereign immunity and jurisdiction. These are just ideas I try to emphasize, but they reign right now. We are completely, still holding these up, and that prevents us from being able to do legal remedies. But what happened in this particular case, these 3 law students had gone to Thailand to study globalization's effects, and they stumbled across these Burmese villagers. I believe they were the Karen people, who were living in hiding on the border of Thailand and Burma because they had escaped, though not without quite a bit of damage. And so they were living in the jungles. And some of them had lost their family. One lost her baby and her husband. I found out about it because I was doing a radio program, and one of the lawyers who had been involved with the case came on the program and to tell us about what they had done. And this was when I discovered, oh my God, there's something that still can be done. How is this possible? How are people getting around these issues of jurisdiction and sovereign immunity? And as it turns out, these Burmese villagers sued Unocal, Total, and Burma in US courts using US law. And I was fascinated by this. So I traced it back and I wanted to find out, how did this happen? How do people make a difference? What's going on? And I traced it all the way back to one person. And this is where I always say one person can make a difference with just enough creativity and just enough ideas. And that was a guy named Peter Weiss, who's still alive today. He's 95 years old. And he was a refugee from the Holocaust survivor, and had sort of one foot in international human rights, one foot in the civil rights movement. And so in a way, this book is uniquely an American story because of how the civil rights movement worked. Because through the civil rights era, one of the things that was going on, which you don't see as much, say, in European countries, is that they were using these individual cases to build a fabric of laws that would apply across the board. And then once they built it for one group of people, they would then take that law and apply it to another group of people, and then build the fabric of law more and more and more and higher, so that it applied across the board. So they did this with women, they did this with impoverished people, they did this with the accused, the LGBTQ. And so having one foot in the American civil rights movement created these ideas and these possibilities of doing this means of changing things. So it's also about the possibility and the promise of the American justice system when it's working properly. And I think people, Democrats abroad, probably know sometimes it doesn't work properly when you have, as we just saw in a case that just happened, some bias on the bench. And I suppose we always have bias on the bench, but it depends which way it's biased, because we're human and we're all biased. So Peter had met a Paraguayan doctor whose son had been tortured to death in Paraguay. And this was done as sort of as punishment and warning to him because he had opposed the Paraguayan regime. And he had no recourse in Paraguay. His son was dead. Horrific way to go. But he and his daughter, Dolly, had come to the United States to track down the man who had tortured Juelito to death. And Peter met them, and Peter thought, well, I think we can expand the civil rights fabric to foreigners who have been aggrieved in these horrific ways using a concept from international law. That concept is universal jurisdiction. And the idea of universal jurisdiction is that some crimes are so heinous that they can be prosecuted everywhere. Well, he needed a statute. But you know what? He found one in the United States from the first Congress, the first Judiciary Act. It was called the Alien Tort Statute. And all it said was that the federal courts had jurisdiction when an alien, that was the word then, now we might say a foreign person, when an alien had suffered a tort that violated international law, in essence. The law of nations was how it was articulated. And he thought, well, that's universal jurisdiction. And so he tried it. And lo and behold, on appeal, they won. They deported the guy out of the United States. And a movement started to be built, because that's the American civil rights movement at the time, right? Other lawyers were like, wow, here's this precedent. We can expand this. We can sue heads of state. And so another lawyer came along, Paul Hoffman and a few others, and they sued Marcos of the Philippines, a class action lawsuit. And they kept building and building and building this. Find a general, sue him. Find a, person who had disappeared your people in Argentina in the dirty war, they sued him. And it ended up being a way that people who had no recourse and no redress for so long, they finally could get it. And as the ideas become adopted, the Congress then passed a law to support them. And this one was called the Torture Victim Protection Act. And then it just continued to be built and grow. Now, since then, I just want to say that the Supreme Court has diminished the Alien Tort Statute extremely and has said now they have a presumption against extraterritoriality, meaning that now the wrong, the tort, has to touch and concern the United States in a meaningful way in order for people to use that statute. Of course, that was never in the language, and it was never really in the intent, nor was it Congress's intent when they said they wanted to shore up the Alien Tort Statute through the Torture Victim Protection Act. And so now the lawyers are being creative and finding new ways, but they have some restrictions that they're running up against. They can still use the Torture Victim Protection Act. That, of course, does not apply to corporations, but they are using common law to go when corporations are being in partnership with authoritarian regimes and engaged in human rights abuses in one way or the other, whether it's aiding or abetting or some other complicity. So the story is one about both how movements start, because they start with ideas and they start with creativity and they start with a person. And this really is about one person starting a movement with these ideas. But it's also a bit of a warning, because rights are ideas too, just like jurisdiction, just like sovereign immunity. These are all ideas that we've adopted and we've made the status quo. And as Charles Epp says, he's a professor in the United States, rights are not gifts. They have to be upheld, and they can be taken down just as easily and sometimes more easily as they can be upheld and expanded. Because in the United States now, what I think I see happening, very much, I think a lesson almost from the Chilean story. And in Chile, longest standing democracy in Latin America, very genteel culture, ended up people were having fights in the street, completely orchestrated at the time by the American right wing. Kissinger was involved, Nixon was involved, the CIA was involved. And what they had done was they put all of the provocateurs in Chile on their payroll. They had put the right-wing media to say all of these untrue, demonizing, dehumanizing things about people who were not of their ideology on the payroll. And then they orchestrated, which we don't see in the United States at the moment, but then they orchestrated an economic collapse. And that really, all of that paved the way in part for the coup that happened. So I think these are things we have to understand, and we have to all be involved, and we have to all be committed to upholding rights in multiple ways. The lawyers who do this work need the laws, and which means that we need to elect the legislators to enact the laws that they can use to then further our rights. But then, of course, they're also involved in the judicial process by, either in the case of a president or a governor appointing, but in some cases they're elected. And so we have to be aware of who, on the state level, for example, who these judges are, because they make such a huge difference. And I know you asked how it originated, and I just started talking about the book. So I'll stop there for a moment and see if there's another question.
Well, thank you, Maria. I mean, that's great. I haven't heard you go through that story of how you came to be, and I love the motivations that put you into the project and also the lessons that you draw from this. And it is inspiring. And also, just reminds us how fragile these gains have been.
Yeah.
And that we just have to relentlessly, support them and keep them being implemented. And I'm often saying to my students, you can pass a law, but then you have to implement it and defend it. And, I think sometimes many people think, oh, we passed the law, we don't have to think about it anymore, right? I guess I have one very specific question, and if other people have questions about, this, definitely put these in the chat. And then I also do have a general question that I hope we can get to, later on. My specific question is, these cases that these lawyers are bringing, these are civil cases?
Yes.
What are they? What if they win? What do they get? If they don't win, what happens?
Yeah. So first of all, I've been thinking a lot about this, and why the other reason why I think I wrote this book was because I saw that civil litigation was kind of a last resort when nothing else was working. And, some of the lawyers said that as well. And I was thinking about the case that just happened yesterday with the acquittal. And I was thinking, it's very often that the government fails, whether it's, prosecutions are really hard because you have to have unanimous jury and that sort of a thing in criminal cases. But also governments, have a variety of reasons why they don't act. And so this is a way that is civil litigation where the harmed person actually gets to take the action. And in a case of like torture survivors or genocide survivors, this is very empowering because they are taking action. And so this was one of the things that Congress talked about. And it was also some of the things that some of the founders of the NGOs talked about, especially a therapist who founded an NGO. Sometimes they get money. In the case of the Burmese versus Unical, it was called Dovey Unical, they settled for $30 million. And they set up a nonprofit and all kinds of programs through that. There was another case where the organization that originally brought that lawsuit, that was founded by those 3 law students, it's called Earth Rights International. They brought a case representing Ogoni people from Nigeria, and they sued Royal Dutch Petroleum in US courts. And they settled that case for about $15.5 million. And that also went into building something called the Kitsy Trust. And they ended up doing all kinds of programs for that. In some cases, you can't collect, either because the person happened to be in the United States and they deported him, and you don't have the means to collect those funds. But it still can serve, sometimes they can. There was one case in which the guy had won the lottery before he was deported from the US. And so they were able to get the money out of that before he could get any of that lottery money. But still, even when they are not able to get compensated directly, it is still a huge deal for somebody who has had all of their agency taken away, to have a court of law hold that person accountable and them to be able to say, this was wrong, it should not have happened. It's a big deal. And in some, whether it's an apology or somebody else, it's still a big deal psychologically. And it still paves the way for other cases like that to happen. I want to say one thing about the war on terror before we go on. And that is that there were many of these cases that were brought by Guantanamo survivors and other survivors of CIA rendition, and the courts would not hear them, in essence, dismissed them all, deferential to the government, to the US government. However, one of the bad things that has happened over time served the plaintiffs in some good ways, and that is that there's been a privatization of military. And that is bad in many ways for so many reasons. You know, it turns people into mercenaries, and you know, there's less accountability. But in this case, the private entities in some of the cases were held accountable and did have to give some compensation to the survivors. One was Blackwater. Wasn't a huge compensation, but the people who survived that I'm going to say the square. Never mind. There was a square in Iraq where one of them had opened fire, and they ended up getting compensated in that. Some of the Abu Ghraib victims, some of them got compensated by the hired security entities and translation entities there. And then also notably, the two psychologists who designed the CIA interrogation program, which was torture, you know, three of them, well, two of them survived. One was the family of the survivor, a guy who died during the black site interrogation. He was like chained to a floor in freezing temperature and died. But the two of them who had survived were able to settle with those contract psychologists and are recovering as a result of the lawsuits. So they get something. It's not the solution. It's a way toward the solution. The solution is to create a just society. The solution is to create a humane society in which these things do not occur. But this is just a step in the way toward that.
Great, thank you. We have a really important comment from Alex. It would be good to have you speak to, because you did start by saying this is your story is an American story. Alex, thank you, is pointing out there's an institution in Germany that takes universal jurisdiction and has used them against multinationals, including the states, successfully. So I don't know if you can speak.
I do.
To that.
Peter Weiss co-founded that too. Peter Weiss, the guy who started this whole thing. What happened with the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, Wolfgang, I'm trying to remember his last name now. Kalek. Yeah, Kalek. That's right. So what happened is in the US, when the lawyers tried to hold the US officials accountable, including Donald Rumsfeld, and the courts wouldn't hear them, Peter was looking around for universal jurisdiction statutes, and Wolfgang had spent some time in the United States. They knew each other through Center for Constitutional Rights. They formed the European Center along with some other lawyers and have been doing really amazing work all across Europe and really in partnership across the entire planet on these cases. There are other European organizations as well. Trial International is one. I think that's my last chapter in the book, is about the globalization of justice and how this how Peter, really one person again, has sort of spawned this movement that has really kind of spread.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, good. And then Dark Star asks a question, which actually is kind of a strategy here about US corporations basically hiring private armies to kill people in their interest. Can we bring them up to the World Court in The Hague for atrocities, and then use civil charges in the US to go for money? So criminal in one domain and civil in another.
Well, so far, like the International Criminal Court is not hearing corporate cases. There are some other means in Europe, the European Court of Human Rights and such, and I'm not an expert on all of those. The US is, if they're US based corporations, then they can definitely be taken to court in US courts. The British are also doing this, which is also in the last chapter. There's a firm called Lee Day, in which Martin Day and his colleagues have been suing, British corporations, including one of the big cases was for Kenya because of the Mau Mau massacres and torture that happened. And they ended up getting a settlement out of the British government even for the Mau Mau. So these are ways that if you put them all together can bring some accountability. There's also talk now about a treaty in which would bring certain behavior, corporate behavior into the treaty so that they could not be involved in these, climate destroying, planet destroying, human rights violating behaviors. But I see that as kind of down the line, but it's got to be one of the places that we look.
Yeah, and Alex, do you want to add something?
I was going to say, if it's okay to make a point in regards to the point that Darkstar made about suing individual people. There was actually a case recently, I heard, that a Swedish or former Swedish executive from a big bank, I forgot their name, got sued for involvement of the drama in Darfur with the banks. And also what you mentioned, Maria, is in terms of treaties and incentives, a lot of actually ways that companies can maybe be forced into maybe better action is that for a lot of loans now, financing, actually a lot of kind of governance can be attached to that. And for instance, in New Zealand recently, for instance, the Warehouse Group got 70 million New Zealand dollars for a certain social and environmental and governance targets. And a lot of that is happening, or even let's say globally happened with Etihad Airways that got a couple of $1 billion loan linked to those social targets.
Yes, I think we have to look at every possible lever that can be pulled to prevent, to stop, and to redress, because they're three different things. And that sounds like sound like really important things to look at. Thank you, Alex.
No problem.
Well, and I really, I'd like, again, Alex's point that speaks to the creativity of, these people in key places, trying to think of different solutions. So I guess just, I don't see any other specific questions, but can I just back you up a little bit? Because I sort of see the parallel here with your other books, looking at journalists who are covering, atrocities, war, genocide, very violent situations. Similarly, people who make a difference.
Yeah.
And I guess, could you talk a little bit about, because I think the story is similar, but in a different area and in a different domain. Could you talk a little bit about your findings from your earlier work on journalism and journalists?
Yes. So there are two books I did that relate to media and the important role of ethical, responsible journalism and really helping people to understand what is going on in policy and politics, and also kind of the deeper, kind of systems and structures. And the manipulation today, I think, is really important, that journalists can help us, help their audiences understand when one side tries to manipulate for power, for example. So a lot of what goes on in the world would not be known if not for journalists. That even includes some of these cases in the books, because they found out about them through journalists. And these were people that were poking around, trying to essentially bring these things to the light of day and risking their lives in many cases. And many of them have lost their lives. They do this because it's important, but it's also a source for both the lawyers and the journalists who do talk and who do tell each other things and who are similarly committed to human rights. They do, it can be a source of burnout. And so I think one of the other really important things that came out of both books is how important it is to keep training the next generation. Now, one of the issues with journalism now is it's become so much more dangerous that for both journalists and for other human rights defenders to actually go, because authoritarian governments don't want the truth to come out. And so there are all these ways of trying to stop them, whether it's stopping their access, not letting them in the border, not letting them pass, censoring their information, jailing them, or ultimately killing them. It's all, again, towards trying to control the truth of the matter from coming out because of the potential consequences, which then come when the lawyers come in. So yes, they're all tied together. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, now Greg has asked a question. We have seen the Texas legislature adopt laws that allow everyday. Oh my God. This is the abortion law. Yeah. So everyday citizens to use the civil courts to halt abortions in clinics. Do you see other countries using that as a model for similarly regressive laws? And just importantly, are progressives pushing back around the world using the courts to protect the environment, worker safety, human rights, and other areas?
Yeah, when I was working in the legislature, one of the things I was working on was what they call citizen attorneys general, particularly for the environment. And this was because there weren't enough environmental lawyers that could do these. And the idea was that, nonprofit organizations could then step into the shoes of the attorney general to then enforce environmental laws. Obviously, now this has been taken, this idea has been taken and used in a way to impair and impede and harm rights. And I think this is just a case, again, where a lot of the great ideas, including free speech, can then be turned on their heads to promote something really negative. So the idea of free speech was so that the best ideas would come and float to the top. But now it's being used to essentially protect hate speech and all kinds of things that are ultimately very destructive. And so similarly, the kind of variation of citizens' empowerment to step into the shoes of law enforcement or to sue and to get rewarded for suing. It's another example of taking something that could have been used for good and being used really to foment more chaos. I still wouldn't want to completely eliminate citizens' abilities to participate in certain types of law, or else these nonprofit organizations can't always do the kind of work that they should be able to do when law enforcement doesn't. So that's, but I suppose the worst part of the Texas one is that rewarding them for taking on these cases that actually infringe on the rights. There was a second part of the question that I don't remember.
Yeah, are there just as importantly, are there successful moves by progressives around the world to use the courts to protect the environment, worker safety, human rights, and other areas?
There are, but the systems are quite different in the other parts of the world. So most of the European countries don't have the common law system that the United States, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and the Commonwealth countries have. So it's a different system where they have, panels, and they don't have they also don't have like the big kinds of payouts that you see in the United States and maybe in the UK that can be disincentives for acting very badly. Many of the other countries also have another thing that's a big problem, which is loser pays. And the United States has it, but they don't use it very often, especially when you've got impoverished people who have used the courts to try to bring some sort of redress or justice. There was a case that is in the book in which the Alaji people of Nigeria tried to sue Chevron, and Chevron tried to get them, when they lost, to pay their all the fees, that is a huge disincentive for people to bring suits. And most countries have a loser pays type of a thing. So it's hard. And this is, again, something that people need to think about, the structural barriers to justice for for people, regular, everyday people who can't afford, multiple teams of lawyers and such. It's really up against a behemoth.
Thank you. Actually, I don't know if Greg or Alex or Darkstar, do you want to follow up on or in any other question?
Or have a comment of stuff that you guys know that we should know?
Yeah.
Greg?
Well, do you mind if I make a comment, Maria, about what you were
Please,
talking
yeah.
about the courts in Europe or something? So what's
Mm.
happening in a lot of countries, including Germany, they've introduced something called a due diligence law, which will come into force next year and the next year, but it's quite vague. For instance, just some key points is that in Germany at the moment, companies with about 3,000 employees or more, they have to follow certain kind of basically loose guidelines on business and human rights and environmental rules, basically drawing from the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, or the equivalent
Fabulous.
OECD one. But then it's very vague in how deep they go into the supply chains, and they use words like they have to come up with the appropriate remedies, basically translated from Germany.
Yeah.
So it's very vague, and yeah, I'm not sure how relevant it is. I mean, if you want, I can send you a link to it.
I would love
English
it. Absolutely. Please do. Look, I think that.
Yeah. But it's not a bad start. And the
It's a great
EU
start.
and the EU also introduced like a fancy thing called it taxonomy, where they kind of want to look at that the same way, but it is very broad again as well. For instance, they say that companies need to account for how much, for instance, from their cost they invest in different social and environmental things. But that's also I think it's very broad again.
Yeah, that could get narrowed and it could get specific as they test different things. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's fabulous. I would love some of that.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a comment or question? Oh, here's Paul. Given that we depend on journalists to bring these matters to light, any comment on investment fund takeovers of mainline dailies like the Chicago Tribune and their gutting of newsrooms? Not that the Tribune is any paragon of progressive journalism.
Almost want to bring Greg into that as a former journalist. Look, I think that the economic model of journalism is really under a lot of strain. It came out of the penny press in the United States ages ago, decades and decades and decades ago, as a commercial endeavor. And they went to these ideas of objectivity and neutrality really so that they could sell papers to both sides, which I think has turned into something really good and ethical and responsible. But I think what's happened in the last few decades is that, Google and Facebook have taken all the potential advertising money, not all, but a lot of it. And subscriptions are difficult to get people to subscribe whenever they get so much for free. And so if they're going to free sources and those free sources are not good sources of information, then you've got some big trouble going on. Now, there are some cases like Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post doesn't seem so far to have affected quality of content. It's been pretty good content. And I know Jennifer has written for them and written great things for them. I've actually gotten to do a couple of things, which is great. So they're doing pretty good stuff. And the New York Times does pretty good stuff, but they do blow it sometimes. There's no doubt about it. The Iraq War is a perfect example of the New York Times blowing it. But then there are other cases, of course, like, when Sheldon Adelson was still alive, he bought the Las Vegas newspaper. Why did he buy that newspaper? Well, obviously he wanted to have some semblance of influence on it. And they did change it a bit because those journalists had been doing some pretty good work in terms of what was happening in Las Vegas. So I think it's a problem. And I think this is something that Russia has wrestled with for a long time. The Russian journalists self-censor because of their oligarch owners and because they are not protected in terms of their jobs if they step on the wrong toes or report on the wrong things. And the fear is that the United States ends up going into that model. I advocate for alternative models. I think institutional models would be really important. I've been advocating for a university-based model for a long time. I think labor
Can you explain
unions,
that?
I think that universities need to come together. And since we're all trying to work on some aspect of enlightening populations, and that together with journalists, universities should be putting out their own media, which was part of the ideas that I had put forward to the University of Auckland. Public media can work sometimes, depending on the government that's installed and depending on the protections that are put in place for those government media. Nonprofit media like The Guardian, which is a trust, those can sometimes work. So occasionally a cooperative model of media where journalists actually own and operate their own outlet, those can sometimes work, but it's so often about where do you get the money? And so that gets tied into the economic system. And if you have an economic system in which you've got billionaires and everybody else, then you've got some problems as well. So, I think, the economic system itself needs addressing as well. But that can also be done with media in which these ideas can come out and hopefully they're infectious enough and can build a better humanity, and then as you're building a better humanity, you get more ideas that can then serve to build the next level and find solutions, because no one person's going to have all the answers.
Thank you. I think those alternative models, how important. And Paul's mentioning a historic example of a union-sponsored and owned media outlet, WCFL in Chicago. And that was the Chicago Federation of Labor. So, a great example there. And then Christine's just mentioning, given everything, all the noise in the mainstream media, 24/7 personality-driven model, it's actually hard to find these really good investigative pieces. And also, I don't know about you all, but I find myself, I need the time and space to really digest them. I've gotten into this skim mode, and it's like to really read these carefully. The Post did a great piece on a real, important story on January 6th, before, during, and after. And as a historian, it was fantastic because they included all these primary sources like tweets and videos and things like that. But to read it carefully, it was about a 2-hour enterprise, right, to really do justice to it. And I think so many of us are so rushed, et cetera. But thank you. We've now had like a really good deep session with you, and I feel like I've been concentrating and learning something, so it's really important. I hate to do this to you, but can you tell us what you're working on now, or what you're thinking about? I know you should be just basking in getting this book out, but I'm sure you, given your creativity and proliferation of ideas, I'm sure you have something.
I have three things. I have 3 things on my plate that I'm hoping to do in the next 5 years. One is looking at a comprehensive barriers to justice that don't look at just the legal and political, but all of the various barriers to justice, including geographic and psychological and cultural. The second one is sort of like Lawyers Beyond Borders, but on the environmental movement. Really looking at that. And I've actually started talking with some of the environmental lawyers who founded the NRDC so far as a place to start. The third thing is the politics of animals, because we are facing a mass extinction like almost never before. Certainly not in, the last known, humankind. And so I'm really wanting to look into the politics of animals there. And then the final one is the politics of human potential. Why is it, that we have all of this like alleged self-help, and why is none of it work? Well, it doesn't work because of the political system. because the political system makes it so hard for people to really expand and grow and be fully who they could be.
Wonderful. And so comprehensive, like you're covering every aspect of life, but I can see where all those ideas have come from, you know.
They're all politics.
Yeah, in your interest.
Everything is politics to me.
Yeah. So, okay, so we just have a few more minutes. Any last comments before we, or questions before we say thank you to Maria and sign off?
Just going to make a couple of points. It's a great presentation, Maria. In terms of the Tribune, I think that's not the noise is not coming from my place. Someone's singing in the background. I think having worked for the LA Times, which was owned briefly by Tribune, I do give the Tribune credit for some great progressive moves, including getting rid of the death penalty in Illinois and some things like that, and some great public corruption case work. But I think, you know, we've been on a downward slide, you know, basically since the Nixon years, where the right understood that the way to get their politicians in power and keep them in power was to buy up papers. And that's really been kind of the tragedy of the last 50 years.
In radio stations.
You know, and they don't buy just any, they buy up the radio stations and, you know, but they bought, you know, in the case of LA Times, you know, Tribune bought the LA Times and all of its papers, and they actually were on a pretty good trajectory there for a while, did some incredible work, but overextended themselves and then wound up selling to a Chicago real estate developer who made money. And that's really been the lesson of the last 15 years. All of the papers that are being purchased right now are being purchased for the real estate, and papers that used to actually have buildings to work in now lease their buildings.
Oh, wow.
Staffs that went from 1,200 when I was at the LA Times, they're down to about 450 now, 500 people.
Amazing.
So it's a real sad thing. And I think the only hope we really have is that there'll be a few people out there that will have the deep pockets to rescue some of these newspapers before it's too late.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
And Darkstar, you had a comment too. Texas law and these Texas legislators want the right to decide for a woman, make them take responsibility for the results, and then apply the idea in a broader global way. Yeah, I love how, as we know, these supposed pro-life people, their interest in pro-life ends as soon as the baby's born. Right?
Yes, that's right.
Oh, I see. Okay, and you're in Encino. So. Yeah. Any last comments from you, Maria, on any of these?
I just want to say thank you. It's really great to be with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. And I think this beautiful day in Auckland has prevented many of our fellow Auckland members from joining. I had a suspicion that would happen because it is just a remarkable day, and being inside on a day like this while we're in lockdown, I can get not showing up. But thank you so much. It was just wonderful to be with you.
Well, Maria, thank you. I mean, if you and Jennifer ever decide to do a podcast,
we've done a couple together, haven't we?
I know. I mean, start your own.
Yeah. Well, there is the Scholars Circle, which I'm involved with. I started it, but
there we go.
My colleague Doug Becker does most of the interviews now. But
okay.
I am the founder. I still do a few.
And we did the radio show podcast, the Americans, in the build up to the 2020 election. So.
Well, you'll have to, every time the two of you do a podcast, make sure you let us at Democrats Abroad in New Zealand know. Well, Jennifer will definitely let us know, and we can promote that as well. So.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
So good to see you all.
So good to see you all. Maria, I'm sure you're right about New Zealand in general, because I'm sitting here in Ratahi looking out the window and going, I have yard work to do.
Totally.
Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks all.
Wonderful.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.